how could believing in an angry, punitive, and imperfection phobic God who sees all and knows all and can, with a snap of a finger, violently punish us in this life for wrongdoing, as depicted in the Old Testament, occasionally in the New, and who can consign us to a place called hell upon death, where we would endure perpetual torment and torture without any possibility of peace, joy, and comfort, not be traumatic. I mean, that's sort of like, yeah. How could it not bring about psychological trauma? That's for me the more interesting question. But it's because it's scary as hell. I mean, it's scary. I don't know. It'd be likened to, your parents telling you about the boogeyman, and like the boogeyman, how real it was and how the boogeyman can harm you. Like, imagine a parent telling a kid that, and the fear and the ripple effects of that sort of, I would call it a traumatic based doctrine, have that kind of effect on us. So it is interesting. It gets into also why some and not others. And I think I'd love to see research on that. For example, I'm a twin, and I experienced religious trauma, and my twin brother did not. And I was deathly afraid of hell. I was deathly afraid of God. But I actually was, and I felt God's love too. So it was this cognitive dissonance producing environment where I really feared God could literally punish me in this life. I got so bound up in what I would call toxic religion to the point of being fearful of drinking soda because I thought I would defile the temple of the Holy Spirit, and in so doing spend eternity in hell. So I was deeply affected by these ideas. And my twin brother, like, how could you? I said, I just took it seriously. Like, if someone is speaking for God and telling me this is who God is and what God is capable of, oh my gosh, like my sensitive heart was like, I want to listen to God. I want to obey God and trust that whatever God says is something that I can really, I must believe in, actually. So it makes sense to me on that level how the teaching of eternal torment can bring about psychological trauma. Phantom theology is this concept that I came up with, sort of this to illustrate this phenomenon where we can no longer assent to doctrines mentally, but somehow still believe in them sort of emotionally, if you will. I'm taking my cue from phantom limb syndrome, a condition wherein after an amputation, people experience sensations of a limb that is no longer there. So similarly, for example, for me, despite no longer believing in hell intellectually and that I was evil and depraved, at times those phantom theological ideas snuck up on me and caused much suffering. And I think, because beliefs tied to, at least we're talking about hell here, beliefs tied to the trauma of hell stick around not because necessarily they're true, but as I write in my book, because they're so darn awful and scary that our brain tags them as sort of ongoing potential threats. So the amygdala, a part of our brain that deals with fear, sends the message, even if I don't buy it now, I don't want to forget it, just in case it might be true. And this part of our brain isn't bothered much about what's factually right. It's just doing its job to keep us from harm. So deciding to ditch the whole idea of original sin in hell is a bit like telling your brain, and I write about this too, about years after surviving a lion attack, like, remember that lion? Well, it wasn't really a lion, even though we would have scars to believe otherwise. So people wrestling with hell trauma will basically told by those in charge who claim to speak for God that we are sinners deserving of eternal torture and torment forever and ever and ever and ever and ever. So it's really not, it's not easy to just erase those memories and the fear that hit us like a ton of bricks. So in that sense, it makes a lot of sense that they become sort of these neuronal networks that are just really hard to let go of, even though we might have different neuronal networks with different truths, the old ones still remain. And then when things in our environment can trigger us, for example, hearing a preacher on TV or something talk about hell, boom, that lights up, and I feel the trauma, my response to what occurred way back then in the here and now, which is the pesky element of dealing with the dragon of trauma, really. The reason why it can be so difficult for some to reject a doctrine like eternal torment, because the theological idea is tied to community. So to let go of that doctrine could also risk being rejected by the community. So because we are social creatures and we have evolved we're neurobiologically wired to connect, that it would be extremely painful to consider not holding to these ideas of the community. And that's, for me, it's, as a side from a sociological perspective, that's one of the gluing elements of hell, is that it was a community forming kind of doctrine to keep people in and to create an us and them sort of mentality, ultimately to keep the tribe safe. So the fear of being rejected by the community is a part of it. If I reject this, I could be kicked out, and that is encoded as a primal threat. Religious trauma. This is an emerging field, and it used to be thought of that religious trauma really came from, well, what was really called spiritual abuse, right? So terms have evolved. And so this is the idea that, of course, that coercive, manipulative, authoritarian leaders could traumatize people, right? But now we know that beliefs, theological ideas, can cause religious trauma. And traumas, by its very nature, it has to do with the nervous system in the body. So this isn't what's called sort of an adverse religious experience, AREs, in the literature. And this is by the Religious Trauma Institute and Reclamation Collective, people who really are thinking through these ideas. So we can have an adverse religious experience and it be negative. I remember the church hurt me, and yeah, that sucked. But then people can move on. But we're talking about trauma. So trauma is by an essence, it's within the tracts of the nervous system. And therefore, people can have all kinds of various responses, traumatic responses to these events that they experience. And some of them could be hell anxiety, for example. Researchers have talked about hell anxiety. There's actually a hell anxiety scale. So what does anxiety do to the body? Of course, it can create this ripple effect of extra glucocorticoids and stress hormones. In other words, it could put people in a constant fight, flight, freeze, or potentially fawn response. So that's painful. That's to always feel like you're on threat. That's going to affect the body. That can affect people's sleep. So many people that I've met with can have insomnia. Some people, it could be related to how they eat. So that sort of nervous agitation, energy, anxiety, it can be so part of their inner world that they can never feel a sense of calm. And if they do, it's so elusive, and then they go right back to this anxious baseline. Many people feel deeply alone. People feel like there's something wrong with them. And so many people wrestle and struggle with religious trauma in isolation. But I just first normalize their experience and say, you're not crazy. These ideas can have a profound effect on us. And if you deal with anxiety, and if you deal with the constant fawning responses and wanting to appease and sort of stay out of harm's way and just trying to acquiesce to what the pastor wants or to what the church wants, or a constant fight response or a flight response, all of these make a lot of sense when we're thinking about religious trauma. And secondly, I do, related to that, is I would just encourage people to be honest about their thoughts and feelings. it's okay to be truthful, to be congruent, to be who you are, where you are, and to talk about what you're wrestling with, what you're struggling with. And that gets into the other piece of this is it's so important to find community. I don't know anyone who can do this without community. And I don't mean some unrealistic number of like having 8 people in our corner. Finding one person, whether it's a therapist, a religious trauma coach, gosh, a rabbi, I don't care, or a friend who's wise, loving, compassionate, empathic. We must work through this stuff in community. And on that note, sometimes the community, for example, sometimes friends are doing all that they can, but you may still find yourself struggling on a on a bodily nervous system level. Remember, trauma can't be talked out of. You can't like read a book or watch something and your trauma be instantly healed. That's not what trauma is, right? So information does not necessitate transformation. And therefore, sometimes friends are great, but sometimes we need a therapist. We need someone who knows how to go deep, who knows the latest literature and research on what it takes to heal trauma, and whether it's understanding memory reconsolidation, polyvagal theory, whether it's experiential self-compassion work, a work dealing with the inner critic that can be so prominent after experiencing religious trauma of this nature. It's going to be so important. And then I would also say sometimes you just need to take a break. If it's too much, I've had people who literally they felt like they were going insane. And the best thing they could do is stop. If you need to stop going to church for now, stop going to church. If you need to put the Bible down, put the Bible down. If you need to stop deconstructing, stop deconstructing. Find things that bring value and meaning and purpose and goodness and a sense of vitality to your life. Try to do some of those things. Put that other deconstruction, reconstruction on the back burner. You got to do what you got to do to stay sane, to stay safe. And those are a few things that come to mind when I think about helping people on the journey.